This podcast is made possible by you, the supporters of WPLN and WNXP, Nashville Public Radio.
This is the Nashvillager Podcast. It's December 17th, 2024. On this day in 1938, Otto Hahn discovered the nuclear fission of uranium. In other words, he split the atom and ushered in a brand new age of weaponry, of power, of risk, but also new areas of scientific exploration and discovery. And given that the discovery coincided with growing military tension rippling through Europe and the world, with its epicenter in his home nation of Germany, Hahn's discovery set off alarm bells that the Nazi regime would potentially develop a new superweapon, the likes of which the world had never seen before. And so, soon after, the United States responded with the Manhattan Project, the ultimately successful race to get to that point first. I'm Nina Cardona, and this is your daily digest of what's happening around Middle Tennessee from Nashville Public Radio, WPLN News. In some ways, it feels like the Manhattan Project never really ended in Tennessee. Oak Ridge was built as a so-called secret city to house the fuel production piece of the atomic puzzle. And after World War II, the need for nuclear fuel just never let up. So neither has Oak Ridge. Right now, the new area of focus is the development of small nuclear power plants. That's the technology TVA is really interested in. You may have heard WPLN's Caroline Eggers report about that. It's also central to a national goal of tripling the amount of electricity generated at nuclear facilities. But right now, the very specific type of fuel needed for those reactors is not made in this country. The U.S. Department of Energy recently picked 6 companies to make fuel for those next-generation plants, and half of those contracts will be carried out in Oak Ridge. 2 deal with different components of enriching fuel using centrifuges. Centris recently announced it's spending $60 million to expand its Oak Ridge factory that makes centrifuges. And then there's Orano USA, which uses centrifuges to enrich nuclear fuel by spinning uranium gas really, really fast. That company broke ground in September on a major new Oak Ridge facility. The third Tennessee contract recipient is Laser Isotope Separation Technologies. And as you may have guessed from that name, it specializes in an entirely different way of making the fuel, one that selectively excites and separates specific molecules using infrared lasers. Now, that last one's a little bit of a gamble. The company's own website calls laser enrichment the holy grail of nuclear fuel production due to the potential for keeping overhead relatively low. But so far, they haven't quite scaled up the process from small lab experiments to industrial-size production. Even that detail reminds me of the Manhattan Project era of Oak Ridge. When the facility was first built, there were 2 competing ideas for how to enrich uranium. And the nation was desperate enough to make it happen quickly that substantial facilities were built to simultaneously try both techniques. We're talking experiments staffed by thousands of people. So with the atomic race overall, there was a race in Oak Ridge between the K-25 and Y-12 facilities. K-25 was the gaseous diffusion plant, which pushed uranium gas all the way through a series of 3,000 barriers that basically filled a giant building. Atoms of uranium-238 would enter. After going through the entire rigmarole, the slightly lighter uranium-235 isotope would emerge. That's what was useful for making atomic bombs. And in the next holler over, the Y-12 facility used electromagnetic devices called calutrons to separate out the lighter form of uranium. Y-12 won the race, but K-25's technology ultimately proved pretty useful too. Now it's time to see which of the later generations methods will work best for fueling the next power plants, or if the future of the electric grid will rely on a combination of centrifuges and lasers. In just a few minutes, a story on the attempt to address opioid addiction in rural communities and the pushback against some clinics. That's coming up after the newscast.
Thematic Static on WNXP is the mixtape we make together, a themed set loosely organized by you, the listener, handpicking songs according to a theme. Airing first Thursdays at 9 a.m. and again Saturdays at 9 a.m., Thematic Static plucks your requests from the socials at WNXP Nashville and by voice memo at 615-320-9100. Thematic Static, the mixtape we make together, supported by United Record Pressing, only on WNXP.
Here's the latest from WPLN News. Tennessee State University's new interim president had his first day on the job yesterday. Dwayne Tucker took questions from the State Building Commission. The agency helped TSU avoid bankruptcy last month by redirecting federal grant money from a building project to general operating expenses. In return, the state wants the school to declare financial exigency. It's a drastic measure that would allow TSU to do things like ending faculty tenure and getting out of contract obligations. Tucker was conciliatory with the State Commission. He referenced a federal government study that found the state has underfunded TSU by $2 billion since the 1980s. But he says the university needs to be realistic about what it can get from the state in the short term.
Prior leadership, to some degree, has created this narrative about funding that could potentially come from the state, but I don't think there's accounts payable at the Tennessee State for $2.1 billion.
Before becoming interim president, Tucker was one of the TSU board members appointed by Governor Bill Lee after the state fired and completely replaced the old board. When kids in foster care are eligible for Social Security survivor benefits, the state takes those checks. One Tennessee lawmaker hopes to end that practice. It's not unique to Tennessee. The Nashville Banner reports most states garnish foster kids' federal benefits and apply that money towards foster care. But the checks go into a pooled fund, meaning they aren't necessarily spent on the children the money was initially meant for. Nashville Senator Jeff Yarbrough argues that's unfair to children who've lost their parents and have very few assets to their names. And he says that's essentially making the children pay for services that the state is required to provide. Last fiscal year, the state collected about $6.5 million in Social Security benefits. That's a small fraction of the Department of Children's Services revenue. Nationally, about 10% of children in foster care qualify for some kind of benefit. More and more, Tennessee farmers are turning to a method known as regenerative farming in hopes of restoring soil health. Regenerative farming involves practices like crop rotation, planting into the soil without tilling, planting cover crops, and allowing livestock to graze and roam the fields. And it's not new. It was practiced by indigenous Americans for hundreds of years and was introduced to southern states by people who were enslaved. But conventional methods used by many modern-day farmers have left soil dry and bare, resulting in produce that lack important nutrients. Now, Tennessee is seeing an increase in the number of farms converting to regenerative methods. The Tennessee Lookout reports that it can be a financial risk for farmers who have to invest in new technologies and learn new methods. And agriculture remains one of Tennessee's most important industries, contributing $89 billion to the state's economy every year. But the payoff can be big. It can cost less during production and lead to a more sustainable and long-term supply of products. There's a new ferry boat at one of the Tennessee river crossings that connects the middle and western divisions of the state. It replaces an old ferry that last year carried about 14,000 vehicles. The new boat is named the Summit in honor of legendary UT basketball coach Pat Summitt. Officials christened the $3 million vessel at a ceremony complete with a rendition of Rocky Top.
Good old Rocky Top. Woo! Rocky Top, Tennessee.
The ferry runs daily, year-round, connecting Benton and Houston counties over the Tennessee River. It costs 50 cents for foot passengers, $1 per car, and never more than $5 for trucks or motorcycles. Chattanooga wants to become something brand new, the nation's first ever national park city. The designation would not come from the National Park Service, but an international organization based out of London. For the last 5 years, it's given that title to communities where people act together to, in the foundation's words, make life better for people, places, and nature. Currently, London and Adelaide, Australia are the only two national park cities. The Times Free Press reports several communities in the Netherlands, Scotland, and England are in competition with Chattanooga to be the next to join the list. You'll find more news anytime at WPLN.org. Tennessee continues to rank second in the nation for overdose deaths, and more than 3/4 of them involve opioids. Medication-assisted treatment is called the gold standard for addressing severe opioid use disorder. But WPLN's health reporter Catherine Sweeney tells us it carries a lot of stigma, both in and outside of the recovery community.
When John Clark is at work, empathy comes easily. He's a certified peer recovery specialist, meaning he shares his own recovery story while offering support to newcomers.
I had been functioning for a lot of years, but then in 2015, my wife and son were killed in a car accident.
He says that was the final straw and what sent his addiction into overdrive.
And within a year period of time, I had lost my career, lost my license, gone from being a criminal defense attorney to a criminal defendant, keeping people out of jail, to being in it myself, to losing everything.
Although his addiction story might feel familiar to the clients he works with, his sobriety story is likely a bit different. He works at a Cedar Recovery Clinic in Nashville, specifically one that offers medication-assisted therapy. He says he was reluctant to take that job at first.
I came up in the 12-step rooms, and I was of the mindset that 100% total abstinence was the only way to go. Well, the longer that I was in my own recovery and the more that I saw, I began to realize that there is no one-size-fits-all recovery.
More than 3,000 Tennesseans died of opioid overdoses in 2022, according to state data. That same year, more than 10,000 people sought care for a non-lethal overdose. On average, 27 people a day. Even the people affected personally by overdose can be skeptical of medication-assisted treatment. Here's Paul Trevette, Cedar Recovery's Chief Strategy Officer.
I previously held that stigma. My father died of a drug overdose in 2010, but it wasn't until one of my good friends I went to college with got help off of these medications that I started realizing that they had a place.
Here's how the treatment works. The medications, like Suboxone or methadone, are themselves opioids. But for people with high tolerances, appropriate doses don't create a high. They stave off withdrawal and cravings. That prevents relapse and allows patients to get back to living a normal life while undergoing therapy and addressing the root cause of their addiction. Dr. Harrison Gray, the medical director at the clinic where Clark works, said he is one small part of the treatment team.
I can kind of hold the door open, but what walks them through is therapy. That's the heart and soul of any MAT clinic.
But there are criticisms against the treatment, even among the recovery community, and that is having a concrete effect on patients in Tennessee. It's driving opposition to new clinics, such as a methadone clinic Cedar Recovery proposed outside of Cookeville. The 12-county Upper Cumberland area doesn't have one, so patients have to drive an average of 100 miles each way for the outpatient appointments. Some concerns don't carry weight after extensive study, like the idea that the clinics bring violent crime to the area. Public health researchers have found that doesn't happen with new clinics, and one team at Johns Hopkins found that crime rates are higher around liquor stores and gas stations than they are around existing MAT clinics. The comments at these hearings focus on things like crime or how effective the treatment is, things that aren't supported by evidence. But another source of stigma is rooted in reality. There are bad operators that take advantage of people. Trevette says that harms all clinics and their patients.
We can't run away from the fact that methadone programs have also had a stigma because our colleagues that have operated them in the past have given it a black eye. Not all of them. There are great providers out there, but there's also providers that try to circumvent rules or try to be motivated by money.
That was the topic of a New York Times investigation published this month. It looked into a Tennessee-based chain called Acadia Healthcare, which, among other things, runs methadone clinics nationwide. The Times found the company operates under a sales culture, trying to bring in as many patients as possible. In some locations, that included giving methadone treatment to people who were addicted to other drugs, like cocaine or methamphetamine. This wouldn't help their addiction and could instead give them a new one. The Times says workers falsified these patients' records to make it look like they were good candidates for methadone treatment. It also says patients were often deprived of the talk therapy and counseling that is supposed to coincide with methadone treatment. Given how widespread opioid use disorder is, Clark says, Tennessee can't afford to continue a fight against MAT.
It is one weapon in an arsenal that we all need because the enemy that we're fighting never needs reinforcements. It never takes holidays. It never sleeps. It never dies. It never goes away.
And he says that's why stigma against medication-assisted treatment needs to end. Catherine Sweeney, WPLN News.
We do this roundup of Nashville news every weekday. Please consider subscribing on your favorite podcasting app. Thanks so much to all of you who have left 5 stars, a thumbs up, a review in your app of choice. That little bit of love really does tell the algorithms that more people should hear about us. And of course, thank you to everybody who gave last week during our winter fundraising, because everything at WPLN News is listener supported, and you can always make a donation anytime at WPLN.org. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. Let's make this day a good one, and we'll catch back up tomorrow.